Welcome back to Playing with the Past. In this episode, Kevin Bertram, owner of Fort Circle Games and designer of the Shores of Tripoli and the co-designer of the Halls of Montezuma, talks with students in my Wargaming class at Clarkson University about game design and the game publishing process. I hope you get as much out of this as I and my students did and enjoy what is coming next from us.
I don't mean to give a full history of gaming, but for the longest time, board games were getting longer and longer to play and more difficult to play. And that was making board games become a smaller and smaller hobby. And the exception to that was in Germany. And a game in 1995 came out called Settlers of Catan, which I was going to ask if any of you have played that. In fact, just even the people in the front row, raise your hand if you've heard or played Settlers of Catan. Yeah, okay. So that really kind of, I think, revolutionized where gaming was, because, you know, even the more popular games like Risk or Monopoly had a real downside in that you had no idea how long they would play. The goal was to eliminate players, and that's not really very fun if you're like two couples want to get together, have dinner, and then play a game, right? Like that just doesn't fit in that kind of lifestyle. So there was definitely a trend of like games had been kind of disastrous, really. And then the harder core history games were becoming, you know, 10, 15, 20-hour games that had all these little tiny pieces of cardboard that weren't very exciting, except if you were really into it. And so if you were interested in history as gaming, it was really kind of a desert. And so with Settlers Catan, this whole kind of Euro game started coming forth where games were shorter, games were more attractive to play. And then where I think the interesting thing that really happened was when a game called Twilight Struggle was released. Now, I'm not sure if Jason Matthews has talked to your class, but as your professor teaches about the Cold War, I'm sure he's familiar with that game. Actually, have any of you played Twilight Struggle or heard of it?
Jason spoke with us a few weeks ago. So.
Oh, good. Okay, well then I won't go. That Jason is one of my good friends, so I'm glad he came and talked to the class. That was really a kind of groundbreak way to approach historical gaming in that it was shorter. You learned a lot. You know, it was a break, I think. And there were some other games that also caused that break. If Volko Ruhnke spoke to you, some of his games kind of caused this break from where it's really sort of almost a marriage of kind of this Euro tradition of games, but instead of the theme being pasted on, it was actually marrying it to actual historical events. So that was both interesting to play, but educational. And so that I've been sort of at the end of that chain of changes in what my company and our designs try to do is make them very accessible, playable in an hour. I'm not sure if you have Votes for Women, that plays more like an hour and a half, but playing in relatively short periods of time with rules that are very accessible that people can play. Like I've been able to teach the Shores of Tripoli to 10-year-olds with no problem. Same with Votes for Women. And so I kind of trying to truncate this long, and didn't do a very good job of it, but try to truncate like this long change of development to get us to where we are now. And where we are now is I think there's a real appetite for games that are on different types of historical topics. So not just wars, and that are playable and accessible. And so you see games that are coming out on interesting topics, you know, Votes for Women, obviously on the women's suffrage movement. There's a game called Stonewall Uprising, which is on the gay civil rights movement. There's games on archaeology. Like there's all kinds of, sorry, my cat's gonna interrupt this. So there's games on lots of different types of history, not just on wars anymore. And so I think that's really exciting. So now you, as game designers, have you're in a golden age of when design is happening. And I think I think it's good that educators are starting to realize that games are a useful tool in teaching. They certainly don't replace reading. They don't replace lectures. They don't replace documentaries, but they're another tool in an educator's toolkit for teaching. And at one level, there's playing games, and you can certainly learn quite a bit from playing a game. As your professor said, he's learned all he knew about the First Barbary War from the shores of Tripoli, and I hope I got that one right then. But also by designing games, I would say is a much more in-depth process of learning, because you have to not only do the research, but then you have to synthesize it into something that is playable. And I guess I'll start to talk about that research now. So when you're researching a topic, whatever the topic that you're is, I'll use the First Barbary War and the shores of Tripoli for most of this discussion, is you want to identify who are the protagonists, like who are the main actors, who are the players going to be. And in the shores of Tripoli, it's a two-sided game. It's pretty simple. If you're doing a game on World War II, though, there's lots of, if you want to take countries, right, is it the West, Germany and the Allies, or and Russia, or do you split out Germany and Italy? Does France count? So you have to just kind of not only identify who the protagonists are, but the scope that you want to examine the particular piece of history, and even the narrative that you're trying to impart. And so in the shores of Tripoli, I had some very specific goals. I wanted to look good. So, like my wife would be willing to play, and I wanted it to play quickly. But also there was a narrative that actually, if you've played the shores of Tripoli, that you should probably gather, is that it is very difficult for a new country in the early 1800s to put some troops on wooden ships and sail them halfway across the world and try and impose their might on another country. That's really, really difficult. And I hope that comes through when you play as the United States, that is a difficult undertaking. So as you continue to research, right, you're going to want to think about not only what the takeaways are that you want your players to have, but also the important high points. So in the shores of Tripoli, obviously there were certain people. The fact that Tripoli had allies, they weren't particularly trustworthy allies to Tripoli, but they were a threat to the United States, so they had to be incorporated in there. Similarly, in votes for women, Tory decided to take the 1848 to 1920 framing. She could have just as easily made it just about the last 2 years, or she could have went longer. And so she used the 1848 because the Seneca Falls Convention, which is really not the start of the women's suffrage movement, but that's sort of the kind of what we're taught in middle school. And so it seemed like a handy place to start, but to explore, who were all the people, what were all the things that had to happen. The nice thing about a game like Votes for Women is that the winning conditions are already set out, right? To pass a constitutional amendment, you have to do two things. It has to pass Congress, and then it has to have 3/4 of the states ratify it. For shores of Tripoli, kind of determining what the goals for each side were a little more difficult. We know what happened historically. Historically, the United States blockaded, we put pressure on their allies, and then we found the Basha's brother in a brothel in Egypt and told him, hey, we'll put you back on the throne. And then once that happened, it was enough for Tripoli to say, okay, let's make peace. And then, of course, we tossed the brother aside, which is sort of a running theme of what we do sometimes overseas. And it was really important to say, okay, well, that was the historical result. That has to be something that can happen. But what were the other potential results? Well, the United States could have actually captured Tripoli and put this brother on the throne. Or the United States could have had terrible, disastrous results, losing half their fleet, and that would have definitely been a loss. Or if they were just not able to stop the piracy and not be able to take Tripoli, well, that would also be a loss too. And so I tried to think of what were the potential outcomes and then create victory conditions around that. So we have a new game coming out called the Halls of Montezuma. It's on the Mexican-American War, and thinking about the victory conditions for that were actually rather difficult. Thankfully, I had a co-designer to walk through this, and two excellent historians who we worked with to kind of figure out what those goals were. And the United States basically ran the table in the Mexican-American War. They won almost every battle. They got what they probably wanted, which was Mexico and California. Texas, New Mexico, and California. Some people wanted all of Mexico. That didn't happen. Some people wanted to lump Cuba into this effort. That didn't happen. But even though the United States won every battle, got all what they wanted, the treaty to sign it barely passed the Senate. And so that war almost didn't end. And if that treaty hadn't been passed, we probably would have ended up with less territory, because the new president was coming in who was far more attuned to a more peaceful resolution, who had been a general fighting in the war, which was sort of amusing. So it's like, how do you create what is a winning condition? So we decided in that, the Polk administration would need to pass certain of their legislative agenda. They would have to prosecute the war successfully, and then they would have to pass this treaty. So then you have to think, well, what would a victory for Mexico be? Well, it would be denying America victory or recapturing Texas, which is what most Mexican elites were very excited to do. And so we're able to fashion a game from what the historical could have beens were, and then that's what we end up with. Now, to be able to do that, whether it's in the Shores of Tripoli or the Halls of Montezuma or Votes for Women, the way we kind of integrated the history into the decision-making for players was that we used cards. And those cards represent people, events, places, or things that could have happened. And I think it's really important, although it gets a tiny bit dangerous, in that you need to take into account what could happen. But the farther and farther and farther you get from that, the further and further away you get from the history. But on the flip side is if you just lay it out, and this was actually an issue that Tori had while she was designing Votes for Women, is at first she wanted the state staff to ratify it in the order that they did. And that really is hard to do in a way that's a game. That becomes more of just like an exercise, right? You're, all right, now Wyoming is ratified. All right, now Utah is ratified. And that's not a game. That's something different. And so you have to find that sweet spot of where there is enough decision-making for the player to feel like they have agency, and they should, and yet not so much that, crazy things don't happen, right? Martians invade on the side of Mexico during the Mexican-American War, or like whatever, just something out of the blue, right? Like you need to keep it, the things that you make up and probably you should identify to your players did not happen, still need to be something that could have happened, and that's where it gets particularly interpretive. So I've kind of rushed through the design process, and maybe I should take a step, and if you have questions about that, or at least about the research process, if anybody wants to ask a question now, or I can jump into the next discussion, which is about kind of play testing and how to make sure it works. What do you think?
So how did you research what historical elements to put into something when you're dealing with a lot of what-if scenarios? How far do you look into the future? What players do you include?
Sure. So a lot of that is determined by your scope. So for the Shores of Tripoli, I decided the scope would just be 1801 to 1806. The war actually ended in 1805. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to look into this time period only. And so I'll talk. So for example, in the game, I'm assuming you're all familiar with the game. And so in the Shores of Tripoli, for example, Tripoli has three potential allies: Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis. And historically what happened was Tunis never entered the war. Algiers threatened, and then we went and paid them off, and that's the card tribute paid in the game. So we said, just stay out of the war, we'll give you extra tribute. And then Morocco declared war, captured one of our ships, and then we sent in a pretty good, most of our fleet that was in the Mediterranean, and said, what's going on? And then he was like, oh, I'm sorry, that was my brother-in-law, big mistake. And that's the show of force card in the game. So in the game, the Tripolitan player can activate these allies, and then it has to be difficult to actually utilize them. So you need specific cards for them to raid. But they don't necessarily all come into play. And so that, I felt like that's a way of having some flexibility. As far as so the winning conditions for the United States, obviously the treaty is how the game, or how the history historically wrapped up. But to be able to invade Tripoli, there needed to be several cards really that helped in. So sending in the Marines is, you're making additional forces available to invade. And the sharpshooters card, and in fact, even attacking Benghazi, which the United States did not do. They went to Tripoli and they stopped, or they went to Dern and stopped because the peace treaty was signed shortly after that because of the pressure that was being put on. But so you need a path that it seems reasonable that we may have invaded Tripoli, right? So General Eaton, who this was his plan, was extremely bitter, and when he came back to the United States, he complained, vociferously that we should have invaded Tripoli and we shouldn't have let our ally hang in the wind. And so that seemed like that's something I can defend, that this was a potential outcome. I don't think I'm getting quite to the question you're asking, because it's really hard. You have to not only read secondary sources that tell you what happened, but it's helpful to look at primary sources that put you in the mindset of the major players about what they were thinking and what they thought their options might be. And I think if you can point back to where at least something was being considered planned, if a plan was being considered, then you could probably make that as an option in the game, if that makes sense.
Not at present.
All right. So, and actually, let me ask a quick question. Is there a requirement to design a game for this class?
There is. That is the key project, such quite a big ask. The students in the room are probably realizing by now, is to design a functional prototype by the end of the
Okay, good.
Present and demonstrate for the class in the final 2 weeks. Which is
excellent. So there are there's a class both at Georgetown and at the U.S. Naval Academy where they do the same thing, and a group of us judge those designs at the end of the semester. So I know how much hard work you're all putting into that. If you want your play test to go well, or your prototype to look good, or to get a good grade on it, frankly, is you need to do some internal play testing first. Like, you don't want to not have the rules clearly understood before you turn the project in or you demonstrate the project. And that is very similar to what we do. We, just because a design is done after a first set, is you need to play test it. Now, the play testing we do is going to be a lot more rigorous, I would assume, than the play testing you're going to do is. But you should at least get 2 friends, maybe it's other people in the class because you're all stuck together, so you all are obligated to do this, and play the game and make sure it makes sense, right? Like make sure nothing is broken. For the Shores of Tripoli, I had something like 350 playtesters, and most of those people did a print and play version. So they print it out and they play it, and they'd send me back results and make sure there was play balance. You're probably not as concerned about play balance right now, but you're definitely concerned that like it just plays smoothly, and that's really important. And it's okay if your early play test materials are really rough. the playtest set I had for the Shores of Tripoli, I had photocopied, enlarged a photocopy of a map, and then I just drew on that. I used playing cards, like real standard playing cards, and then just printed the text of the card and taped it on the card, and used like whatever game pieces I had for the different ships and gold and whatever. And I assume you're going to be doing something fairly similar to that. But play test as soon as you can, as early as you can, because you're going to find things that are broken, right? In Shores of Tripoli, originally the gunboats that the Americans build was a card, and there was no option to build a gunboat or to build a Corsair. United States building a gunboat and Tripoli building Corsair, and that meant you either played a card for an event or you played a card to move as the Americans and to raid as Tripoli. And we realized after some playtests that was really limiting. Like, you need to give a little more decision making that creates a little more pressure for each player. So they're like, do I build my fleet up or do I press forward now? And so that pushes them to a decision point. And I don't think that, something like that will be evident when you've done your first design without playing it and playing with someone who doesn't have all of the rules in their head the way you do. So I understand what it's like to be in college. The time pressures are pretty rough. But if you can take that time to play test it with a couple folks in your class or out of your class would even be better. I think that would be very valuable for you. So that play testing process is really important. And then, I can continue to talk about the design process that's not really helpful for your class, but if you're interested in being a developer or being a designer is very helpful. You always want to have artwork in mind. So the nice thing about anything before 1923 is the newspapers don't have a copyright for them because of U.S. copyright law. Anything revolving around the American military has tons of artwork that's public domain. So almost all the artwork in Shores of Tripoli came from the U.S. Navy Heritage Command, and they just it's their job to help you. So if you have a game that is rooted in particularly in a war, in a U.S. war, you have lots of resources available to you for artwork. Obviously, if you have an artistic person on your team, or I'm not sure if these are group projects or not, but a little having your playtest look good will help, even if your professor says it doesn't matter. It really does matter. I've had games on my table or on my shelf that I didn't play for a couple years because I just thought they were too ugly. And I'm supposed to be a professional and just evaluating the game, and yet you can't help but be affected by the aesthetic of the game. So I certainly would encourage you to put a little bit of effort into that for your playtests. And then I could talk to you about publishing, but I get the feeling nobody probably really cares about publishing. Although if anybody does, then I'd just ask me the question and then I'll walk you through what that process looks like. So I think that sort of wraps up my prepared comments. And I apologize if it wasn't quite what you were looking for, but if we leave more time for a question and answer, then I'm happy to go in depth in any question that you might have. So.
Oh, this has been great. Actually, I think there probably is interest in the publishing side of things. I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. We have quite a entrepreneurial group of students as a student body. So I think anything that you're thinking about the broader industry beyond academia is for them. And actually, Clarkson is an interesting place because although I'm teaching a history class, 90% of our students going through history classes are actually doing other majors. So I think there is actually a lot of interest in the creative industries and games and things and publishing. So I think there are certainly, I'm seeing that there are certain people would certainly like to know more about the publishing.
Oh, certainly. Well, let me jump in then real quick. So, there's two routes you can go, and I looked at both of them. You can find a publisher who will print your game, or you can self-publish. And even though I have a company and I publish other game, like my first game was fundamentally a self-publish, right? I self-published the Shores of Tripoli and created a company around it. If you want to publish, find a publisher, actually feel free to email me once your designs are done, and I can find the right publishers that you should pitch. I might be the right publisher, or if there's other publishers, then I'm certainly happy to help out in that process. You definitely want to make sure your product matches their product line. Our goal is games that are under an hour and a half, preferably under an hour, that we can make look pretty. That's pretty simple. There's lots of different companies that have different aesthetics and different goals and what they're looking to publish. If you're going to self-publish, however, that's where I think there's a lot to it. It is a big undertaking, but no one is going to love your baby like you do. And so there is no way your game will be as good if another publisher publishes it instead of you publishing it yourself. That's what I found when I was shopping Shores of Tripoli around, is no one wanted to have wood ships, and no one wanted to have, the investment in the art for the cards, because they didn't believe in the game except as just another product for them to sell. Whereas, I believed in the game as this is history that I find very exciting. There's a couple things. The best thing to do is just to be born rich. I am not. Or I was not. And so the second best option is crowdfunding. So once you have a game that you're pretty confident that's pretty good, and if you want to self-publish it, go through all the, set up an LLC and do all of those things. But then Kickstarter and now other crowdfunding sources like BackerKit are pretty good ways to get the funding that you need to be able to publish a game. When you publish, you can do publish a couple of ways. There are ways to self-publish in the United States on a print-on-demand model. The plus side to that is you're not putting up a lot of capital. The downside is that it's much more expensive and the quality is not nearly as good. So I'm trying to think of a game. If any of you are familiar, well, let me see on just a second. All right, so this is a game that was published by a print-on-demand publisher called Endurance. Right, it's got a nice box. I'm not sure if you can tell. And there's some dice, there's some cards. They're not as quality cards as you would have coming from China. There's some counters. There's a map in here. This game is actually very cool. I've played it, even though this one I just opened, about surviving Antarctica. And the game's called Endurance. And it's a really nice little package, but that was about $25 per copy to print on demand. In comparison, the Shores of Tripoli, which you guys have seen and touched, has nice wooden pieces, has linen finished cards, thicker box. That box could be used as body armor. That was $8 to publish. So there's an economy of scale. If you print in China and you're printing in some quantity, I think 1,500 is about the minimum that you can print now. You're going to be able to print, much higher quality at a lower price in China. But that might not be how you wanted to publish your game. So you can do these print-on-demand models like this that are, they're okay. They're not great, but they're good. And then if you print on demand, this is probably not going to work. But if you do have your game printed in China, the way the distribution models work here in the United States is you have a manufacturer suggested retail price for Shores of Tripoli at $60. If I sell that to a local store, I charge them $30 plus shipping. So, and they have to order a minimum of 6. And that's because the retail store needs to make their profit. And so it's a 50% discount. So when you're kind of thinking about how much you want a game to cost, that sort of is where you kind of start doing some back math. So for this endurance game, which costs about $25 to make, that doesn't really work because you're only making $5 of margin, but you've had artwork and you've got other costs and designer royalty and everything that goes into it. So it's really hard to sell to stores if you go the self-publishing route. And then if you sell to what's called a distributor, who then sells to stores, you only get 40%. So it'd be $24 on the Shores of Tripoli. And they usually make you pay for shipping. So it becomes very difficult to find a game at a price that works, that you can publish it. You usually want what they call the landed cost of how much it costs to print the game and get it here to be about, and then you take that number and multiply by 10 or by 5 or 6 to get your landed cost, or to get your MSRP. So the landed cost all total for Shores of Tripoli was about $11 times 5 or 6. That's where we got the $60 MSRP. I realize I'm actually being really scattershot about the publishing piece. I'm happy for your professor to give my email out, and I'm happy to answer very in-depth questions that isn't so scattered that the way I'm doing it now. But yeah, publishing is very exciting. So if there's an entrepreneurial spirit in there, like, I'm happy to walk you through any of the parts of that. So yeah, I think I'll just end on that point. But there's obviously a million more things to talk about if you want to publish your game.
I'm trying to think how to phrase this properly. When you're going to publish, how much of like the artwork and the polished product do you need to have like set in stone, and how much do you need to be willing to kind of work and change with the publisher itself?
Well, if you're sending this, I'm not sure the question you're asking, so I'll answer two different questions. If you're sending this to a publisher, they're probably going, well, actually, that's not true. Let me take a step back. It depends on the publisher you're sending it to. Certain publishers have their own art departments, and they will do quite a bit with it. And so it doesn't need to be fully developed, and don't waste too much money, time developing the art. It needs to look good and presentable, but it doesn't need to be a final product. There are publishers who will just publish what you send them. I'm not fond of those publishers, but since this is being taped, I'm not going to call any particular company out. So in that case, then you need to be responsible for it. If you're publishing it yourself, obviously what you're sending to your printer needs to be 100% ready to go. So there's sort of 3 different answers depending on what you're doing. If you're going to a publisher that puts a lot of effort into their artwork, then the focus should be on the gameplay, but make sure it doesn't look, ridiculously ugly. There's some publishers who will just publish whatever you send them. Well, then, it's still your name on it, even though they're publishing it. So you definitely want to make sure that then it's pretty high quality. And then if you're publishing it yourself, then obviously you have to, you're responsible. The manufacturer in China is not going to edit something for you. That's not their job, right? That's your job to make sure that's a quality finished product.
I'm kind of following off of that. Do you see, like, when you pitch a game to a publisher, do they often, like, say they like your idea, do they ever, like, kind of go into the mechanics of what you've done and suggest or make edits, or is that kind of all sitting on your head?
Oh yeah, it definitely happens. So there's something called the Zenobia Awards, which is a game design competition for people who are historically not represented in the gaming industry, i.e. white males. And there was a great design that came out of England about, well, let me take a step back. Instead of giving a specific example, let me maybe say a little larger. Some publishers, like there's some games that will come to a publisher that just look great, right? And they work. And you're like, yes, let's publish this right as it is. And then there are some games that are like, oh, this is pretty good, but this piece here doesn't work, right? Because the publisher is going to go through a testing process, right? Like you're going to play it with them, or you're going to send them the prototype and they're going to play it. I mean, I play, you know, probably 30, 40, 50 prototypes a year, and I'm going to play it and I'm going to have questions. And, you know, some designs are just right, and some are interesting and have a lot about them that you like, but you're like, this piece doesn't work, at least for me as a publisher, right? Or what we're trying to, you know, let's say your game takes 3 hours, but there's an easy way to make it play 2 hours. All right, well, that's the suggestion we might make. But you know, it's still your design. So, you know, like make sure the game meets your vision. But obviously, you know, no offense, but none of you have ever published a game before. So it's good to listen to at least what other people might have to say about your game, ways to make it better. Now, some of them might be totally wrong, but, you know, I would at least listen if a publisher said, hey, I like 90% of what you have, but there's this 10% that I think needs to be fixed. I think that's not an unreasonable thing to happen.
What's your way of getting around like a range from 2 to 4 players? Like if there's an odd number, where like if you're designing a game, how do you work if it should be like a cutoff of 2 or cutoff of 4, like in between, like how do you decide that?
Sure. So, you know, that's part of your design scope, and you know, you kind of need to identify the history of it. So the Shores of Tripoli had to be a 2-player game, right? It's a 2-sided game. There's no third power that exerts anywhere close to the level of effort into this conflict. But some games, I think, you know, it depends on how historical you want them to be. So we have a game on the history of the Supreme Court, and the players, it starts in 1789, comes to current day, and the players are trying to basically have the most renowned victory points by being on the right side of certain cases and that they're arguing for, and then they manipulate the makeup of the Supreme Court or try to push the Supreme Court to be more conservative or liberal on particular tracks. And in that, because the players aren't particular and protagonists, like you're not the Heritage Foundation or, you know, the Whig Party or anything like that, but you're kind of more generally a philosophy and things like that. It's a little easier to have multiple players, right? Or different player counts, right? 3, 4, 5, it doesn't matter. I have a design actually for the Folger Shakespeare Library where your rival printer is trying to print Shakespeare's First Folio. And while in a way it's a little ahistorical, because really, although a lot of people were interested, there's only one kind of group that really kind of pushed forward and did it. But there were other printers that could have done it. And so in that game, you are one of these rival printers. And in that, you know, there can be 2, 3, 4, 5 players. And so it sort of depends on your topic if it's amenable to making it multiplayer or just 2-player, if at different player counts can make it work. Like, you know, if you have a game about World War II, let's just say there's the West, there's the Axis, let's say World War II in Europe to make this easier. So there's the West, right? The US, the UK, France, the Commonwealth, whatever. That kind of is one set piece. Then you have someone as Germany and the rest of the Axis powers in Europe. And then you have someone as the Soviet Union. All right, well, that's pretty clearly a 3-player game. Can you make it a 2-player game where the Soviets and the Allies are allied? Well, yeah, I mean, they were kind of on the same side, so you could make it a 2-player game. Or how do you make it a 4-player game? Do you make Italy its own power? Or do you break the United States and the United Kingdom up? So like, it goes back to the earlier discussion of what's the scope you want of the game. And depending on how flexible you are with that scope, then you can have more players or less players, and you can make the game playable with 2, you can make the game playable with 5, if you scope it right, if that makes sense. But I think if you're looking for, I think I know it was helpful for my first design to be a two-player game, a two-sided game, because it limited the amount of permutations that I had to be worried about, right? Like, will these two sides gang up on this? Like, all those kind of interactions that are really hard to play test. And so that's why for me, it was very easy, or it was much easier. I wouldn't say it was very easy, to do a two-sided game. But if you have a game that really needs 4 players, make the game 4 players. I know there's a recent design on the Treaty of Westphalia that's a 6-player game and it can only be played by 6 players. Now, you know, is it easy to get 6 people to play and only 6 people to play a game? I mean, that, you know, that depends on your friend group, I guess, but there's a market for games that are very specific like that. So, you know, I would do what the history sort of leads you to do, if that makes sense, or what your research leads you to do, and in that scope and and narrative that you're looking for. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So what are the topics? Like, so if it's 30 students, I'm certain like 4 or 5 person groups, so you have probably 6 or 7 groups. Like, what are the topics that are being researched and turned into games? Are they all wars? Are some of them political?
They are a mixture of things, but I will let students call out what they're working on.
Berlin airlift setting.
Oh, nice.
We're working on the Emu War.
The Emu War of 1932 in Australia.
The Emu War?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Which actually, when it was proposed, I thought someone was making fun of me because I mentioned the study in Emerald in an email, and then I went and looked it up, and I was like, wow, this is actually a really quite serious conflict that the Australian government got involved in. So, you know, that was an interesting topic. I think it lends itself really well to where they're going with the design.
We have a 6-player simulation of the complexities of modern warfare involving conventional large-scale operations and counterinsurgency mixed together in the same battle space, and it's represented by a conflict between deer and coyotes in upstate New York using modern military equipment.
So I just want to understand this. You have coyotes driving tanks?
Yes, sir. Coyotes driving tanks, APCs, using artillery pieces, building assault rifles, squad machine guns, sniper rifles, and also being artillery struck with as civilians in by the deer. The deer sometimes accidentally hit coyotes.
So there's a North Korean propaganda cartoon called Squirrel and Hedgehog, and they are, you know, the loyal North Korean citizens, and they are fighting against South Korea, who are mice, Japan, who are rats, and then the United States, who are wolves. And I always thought that would make an amazing game. And I'm like, I feel zero issues with ripping off North Korean propaganda cartoons to make a game. So that your game sounds more interesting than I should probably admit. So
Thank you, sir.
Greek siege warfare, ancient Greek siege warfare.
the siege part.
We're currently looking at the siege of Syracuse, the base of Rome.
Yeah, that's a good topic. There have been a couple games on that done, but I think it's a really interesting topic. So I'd love to see what you end up doing with that.
I guess we do ours. We are doing more of a political game that is about gaining social, monetary, and I guess physical influence in different regions of a country that has a election setup similar to the US, where there are states that have districts that you need to win.
But you're doing a made-up country instead of the United States proper. That's fair.
Oh yeah, and you can lie in it. We have a mechanic where some of the cards that you play to conduct actions need one or more resource cards. And you can play your resource cards face down and lie about which ones you have. And getting called out on that can hurt your influence.
I'd like to take a look at that. To be honest, I'd like to take a look at all of them, but you know.
Well, I'm going to film the final presentation so we can share those with you.
Well, I know, to be honest, I'm not sure who else has spoke to your class, but I know Volko and Jason pretty well. In fact, I'll be publishing games by both of them. But if one of them is easy to make as a print and play, just send us the files and I'll play it with Volko and Jason and see what we think. So
yeah, they've both spoken with us in the past few seconds. We have more designs, so we'll let more students chime in.
Yeah, for our design, we are modeling the different security interests that go on inside of a state when there's, say, a mass uprising. The concerns about securing documents, but also other powers who want to move in and take advantage of that.
that's not topical at all. That was a joke. It's very timely. Interesting.
Yeah, I think you were just playing block by block uprising, so there might be some ideas coming.
Well, so one thing I was going to say, and I should have said this much earlier, is don't feel bad about stealing other ideas in other games, right? Don't just like directly copy them, but use the best, because that's what we all do, right? Like the Shores of Tripoli draws from, games that Jason designed and Mark Herman designed, and, Votes for Women has a lot in common with a game called 1960, which is a presidential election. It has some differences because it's not a presidential election. You're passing a constitutional amendment. So they're different processes, but there's some similarities, state by state elections going on. Don't hesitate to see other ways that people have done things. But at the same time, definitely try to, add your own flourish to it. Yeah, so good. Those sound like good things.
Yeah,
Any other questions? I'm sorry.
I'm excited to see these games develop. So where we're at so far is there was an initial design proposition, and this week we're getting scenario briefs submitted, sort of fleshing it out, and then they're going to start presenting designs and feedback and get into the playtest. So I guess we're about a month, 6 weeks out of the final presentation. So there's a lot of quite tight actually. The constraints of a 14-week semester trying to move through, while students are doing everything else at the same time. It's quite a lot, but I'm really excited.
Well, I'd love to see whatever comes out of this. So, and if anybody is stuck on a design question, feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk you through it. I end up doing that a lot more for other designers who aren't publishing with me. But it's just, I have a lot of free time. So
I think that's a great offer. Great to hear. I mean, one of the things I think students have discovered, something I've become aware of, is how supportive the game design community is. Great raft of speakers, including you, come and speak to us and give their time because they want to help and support things and are interested in what's going on. It's great. That's been a great thing to interact with. It's a bit of a different experience in a university course, but normally you have one person who stands in front of you and delivers it all rather than bringing people in. Here's my take on some of the things you're talking about.
super.
Are there any other questions for Kevin? No, I think we have run out of questions, so I think we will let you go. And thank you once again for giving up your time this morning and for talking to us and your very kind offers to look at and play people's games and prototypes and give them advice and talk through things. And I know certainly there's several groups who are already interested in publication and the other side of this class. One of the things I would hope is that we don't stop in December. This sort of becomes a something where they've got to a prototype point, and then the wheels can keep going. So I hope there's going to be lots more conversations.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks everybody for spending an hour with me. I hope it was helpful.